Welcome to Spotlight Matthew for today as we continue to look at the Passion of Christ, the events beginning on Monday, Thursday, or in the upper room, and concluding, of course, at the end with the glorious resurrection of Jesus. We find ourselves as we continue today on that night that he was betrayed to suffering and to death, and move then from there to the following morning when Pontius Pilate renders his verdict and presents to the crowd both Jesus and Barabbas. And of course we know that the crowd, inspired by the religious leaders, cry out, "Crucify, crucify, give us Barabbas." Well, let's review all those who are responsible thus far for being guilty or playing a part in being responsible for what will happen to Christ here and is unfolding in these last hours of his life before his death and resurrection. First of all, of course, are the religious leaders. They've been out to get Jesus for a long, long time, and finally they see themselves now succeeding. Second, of course, the one who makes it possible for them to do so is Judas, the betrayer, the son of perdition, the one of whom it was said it would have been better had he never been born than committed the act that he did. Third of all, we look and see the acts of Pontius Pilate, who is responsible and should have called Jesus innocent because Jesus is a righteous man, as his wife even said, based on a dream that she had had. But instead of stepping up and standing forward in what he knew to be right, he acquiesced and abdicated to the madness of the crowds who played their role, as we just mentioned, in what will be happening to Jesus. Today we come to yet another set of individuals who are involved and responsible and guilty for the suffering and death of Jesus. It is the soldiers, the Roman soldiers, to whom Pilate turns over Jesus after he renders his verdict. And let's, before we read this passage, note that the Jews hated the Romans. They viewed the Romans as those who were overlords occupying territory that belonged to the Jews, and more importantly, they believed it was God's territory and belonged ultimately to Yahweh, the God, the King of heaven and earth. And yet these usurper Romans were there, and the Jews were not hesitant to let them know exactly what they felt about them. So reciprocally, the Romans despised the Jews right back, and they would beat Jewish criminals or victims mercilessly before crucifixion. And it was, of course, a chance for them to vent their spleen and to do it legally. This was sanctioned at this point by the law. And Jesus, though he was not a political criminal, was branded as one, as King of the Jews, an insurrectionist. So you can only imagine the full foment of the anger and wrath that would come from these Roman soldiers who were trained to be brutal and violent in torturing a Jewish convict. Sometimes it was noted in the literature that the convict would sometimes fail to survive the beating and would die before even getting to the cross. So we know that Jesus was brutally and violently scourged and whipped and scorned by these Roman soldiers. And that's what we look at in today's passage, which is chapter 27, beginning in verse 27. Then the soldiers of the governor, Pilate, took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. And they stripped Jesus and put a scarlet robe on him. And twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spit on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes back on him and led him away to be crucified. Now, aside from the torture that is being inflicted upon Jesus here, I think we need to note the theme of Jesus as royalty, as a king in this passage. We know that the political charge is the one for which he is being punished, not the religious charge. And so, looking at it, we see this imagery of the King of the Jews throughout this particular incident. First of all, there is the scarlet robe that is to represent the robe of a king, a regal robe that has been put upon Jesus in mockery. Secondly, we see that there is a crown, to be sure, but it is the crown of thorns instead of a crown of gold that they place upon Jesus' head. And we should note they would have pushed the long thorns deeply into his skull, and as the head bleeds profusely, no doubt it was a bloody mess. Then they took a reed and put it in his right hand, whereas royalty would hold a scepter within that right hand. And they come and they kneel before Jesus in mockery instead of kneeling before Jesus in fealty and obedience and allegiance to him. And they say to him, "Oh, hail, King of the Jews." And of course, the bitter irony here is that Jesus is not only the King of the Jews, he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He is even king over these soldiers, king over Caesar himself. And yet, instead of being recognized in any way in his rightful role, his rightful state, he is mocked and belittled in every possible way. And so they conclude all of this mockery of royalty by spitting upon Jesus and striking Jesus, beating Jesus to a pulp. And we do see that Jesus was so weakened in verse 32 that he was unable to carry the cross beam to his own cross up to Golgotha. Therefore, Simon of Cyrene had to be drafted to do so, but that's just an indication of how violent the beating was that Jesus sustained from these Roman soldiers who have added themselves to the list of those responsible and guilty of what is happening to Jesus here. I simply want to end this particular short devotional by reciting to you some of the words of one of the great passion hymns in the life of the church. It's an ancient one, so if you're more into contemporary music, you might not know this one, but the words are well worth taking deeply into heart despite the archaic language. They are attributed to a man named Bernard of Clairvaux, who lived in the 12th century. And the first verse that I'll read has to do with the humiliation of Jesus as he is before these Roman soldiers, and then the second, our response to this humiliation that Jesus endures for us. So verse 1, the humiliation of Jesus. O sacred head now wounded, with grief and shame weighed down, now scornfully surrounded, with thorns thine only crown. How art thou pale with anguish, with sore abuse and scorn? How does that visage languish, which once was bright as morn? Moving from that humiliation to our response. What language shall I borrow to thank thee, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end? O make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love to thee. O make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love to thee. Meditate upon these words as you read again the soldiers' beating of Jesus before his crucifixion. Read and reflect and pray about what Jesus suffered, about the sacred head that was wounded for us and for our salvation. That's Spotlight Matthew for today. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you next time.